This war did not escalate today. It exposed itself. In less than a single day, diplomacy didn't fail quietly. It collapsed publicly, decisively, and without ambiguity. One rejection did what months of negotiations could not. It stripped away pretense. It forced every major player to stop acting and start revealing. Putin revealed that peace on his terms was never peace at all. Trump revealed that humiliation was never an option. And Ukraine revealed something far more unsettling to the system. It will not be managed, traded, or spoken for. I've watched global crises for decades. Moments like this are rare. They are not loud because of explosions. They are loud because history shifts direction. If you think today was about a ceasefire, you're already behind. What actually changed was the structure of power. Stay with me, because to understand what comes next, we have to confront how this system was built to fail. What you're witnessing is not confusion, it's collision. Three actors entered this moment believing they were shaping the end of the same war. In reality, they were pursuing three incompatible outcomes. For Washington, the goal was control managing escalation, containing costs, preserving leverage. For Moscow, the goal was validation, forcing recognition that power, once seized, cannot be questioned. And for Ukraine, the goal has never changed: survival with sovereignty intact. These goals can coexist temporarily. They cannot conclude together. That is why today unfolded so violently, not on the battlefield, but in diplomacy. Because ceasefires don't fail when details are wrong. They fail when worldviews no longer overlap. What broke wasn't a proposal. What broke was the assumption that Ukraine could be discussed without Ukraine, that great powers could bargain stability while smaller nations absorb the price. This war has now entered a phase where alignment matters more than intentions. And to understand why this collision was inevitable, we need to trace its origins not to speeches, but to systems. Because this crisis didn't begin with a rejection, it began years ago when the foundations were quietly laid. To understand why this moment was unavoidable, you have to stop thinking in headlines and start thinking in cycles. For more than a decade, the international system has been running on deferred conflict. Problems were postponed, not resolved. Contradictions were managed, not confronted. After the Cold War, expansion replaced integration. Security was promised without consensus. Economic interdependence was treated as a substitute for political trust. Russia absorbed grievance. Ukraine absorbed vulnerability. And the West absorbed comfort. Each phase built pressure, NATO expansion, without a parallel security architecture. Energy dependence without strategic redundancy. Sanctions without an off-ramp. Diplomacy without enforcement. None of these choices caused war on their own. Together, they created a system where miscalculation became inevitable. By the time Russian troops crossed borders, the real failure had already occurred. Not of intelligence, not of warning, but of imagination. Leaders believed escalation could always be paused, that time would soften demands. That exhaustion would force compromise, but history doesn't reward delay forever. Eventually, cycles converge. And when they do, the first shock is never the biggest one, because the real crisis begins when theory meets reality and breaks. The first real rupture didn't come with tanks or missiles. It came with silence. When Putin stopped signaling, analysts knew what that meant. Not hesitation, preparation. In diplomacy, silence is not absence. It's intent forming behind closed doors. The ceasefire proposal was never meant to solve everything. It was meant to test something far more important: flexibility. And when the response arrived, it was absolute. No counteroffer, no sequencing, no room to maneuver, demilitarization, permanent exclusion, territorial recognition. Everything demanded, nothing conceded. That wasn't negotiation. That was declaration. And here's why this moment matters. Leaders reject proposals all the time. They rarely do it in ways that foreclose the future. This rejection wasn't designed to move talks forward. It was designed to assert dominance and impose humiliation. If you've studied crises long enough, you recognize this pattern. When leaders feel pressure internally, they escalate externally. They choose rigidity because flexibility looks like weakness at home. So when missiles followed words within hours, it wasn't coincidence. It was choreography. And once that line was crossed, there was no returning to incrementalism because the system had been forced into its next test. How power responds when compromise is publicly refused. To see what's really happening, you have to look beneath the statements and into the machinery of the system itself. This war is not being driven by emotion. It's being driven by constraints. Putin is trapped by his own narrative. After years of framing the conflict as existential, any outcome short of total validation becomes politically impossible. Compromise in that framework is defeat by another name. Trump, on the other hand, operates on leverage. Offers are not endpoints. They are probes. When leverage fails to produce movement, it must be recalibrated or abandoned. And Ukraine sits inside both of these logics while belonging fully to neither. It cannot accept validation politics. It cannot be reduced to leverage. That is the hidden mechanism. Each actor is responding rationally within an irrational system. A system where escalation is safer than concession, where delay is interpreted as weakness, where credibility matters more than cost. This is why diplomatic failure now triggers military response almost automatically. The gears are locked. Once Putin rejected the proposal in total, the system demanded reaction, not restraint, response. And when systems reach that stage, outcomes stop being negotiated. They start being enforced. Which brings us to the second rupture, faster, sharper, and far more consequential. The second rupture didn't unfold over days. It unfolded over hours. This is how you know escalation is no longer theoretical. Within a single afternoon, the rules shifted. Emergency meetings replaced briefing notes. Deliberation gave way to decision. When Washington moved, it didn't speak first. It acted. Capabilities that had been debated for months were suddenly approved. Systems once held back by escalation fears were fast-tracked. Not symbolically. Operationally, this wasn't impulse. It was signal. By targeting reach, defense, and sustainability. The response was designed to alter calculations, not headlines, to change what Moscow could do, not what it could say. And this is where many misunderstand what happened. This was not escalation for escalation's sake. It was escalation to restore asymmetry. Putin's rejection assumed hesitation. It assumed that political investment would create paralysis. Instead, it produced acceleration. That's a dangerous moment in any conflict. Because once speed becomes a strategic asset, restraint becomes harder to justify. The system had crossed from managing risk to accepting it. And while Washington recalibrated pressure, something else was happening. Something that unsettled both allies and adversaries alike. Because for the first time in this phase of the war, Ukraine didn't wait. Now, I want you to think about this from where you are sitting. Because wars aren't experienced in strategy rooms, they're experienced in kitchens without power, in cities listening for sirens, in lives measured in days, not plans. For Ukrainians, today wasn't about leverage or signaling. It was about dignity. When Ukraine convened its Security Council, coordinated with allies, and issued its own conditions, it wasn't posturing. It was drawing a line that says support does not equal surrender. Partnership does not mean silence. And survival does not come at the price of sovereignty. This is what agency looks like in real time. And it's uncomfortable, especially for systems built on hierarchy. If you've ever felt decisions about your future being made without you, then you already understand this moment. Because Ukraine isn't rejecting peace, it's rejecting erasure. If this perspective matters to you, don't disengage now. Share this conversation. Stay informed. Because wars don't end when people stop fighting. They end when people refuse to disappear. And that refusal is now shaping the next phase of this conflict. What happens in Ukraine never stays in Ukraine. The moment this conflict crossed into open strategic defiance, it became a stress test for the global order itself. European capitals understand this instinctively. This isn't just about borders. It's about precedent. If force can redefine sovereignty without consequence, then every security guarantee becomes conditional. Every alliance becomes provisional. Every smaller nation becomes negotiable. That's why coordination accelerated so quickly. Not out of idealism, but necessity. Energy markets react, defense postures shift, non-aligned states recalibrate their bets. In Asia, policymakers are watching how resolve translates into action. In the global south, governments are measuring whether rules still protect the vulnerable or only the powerful. This is how regional wars globalize, not through geography, but through example. The danger now is not immediate collapse. It's normalization. Normalization of permanent instability. Normalization of frozen conflicts. Normalization of a world where endurance replaces resolution, and once instability becomes the baseline, every future crisis becomes harder to contain. Which brings us to the only question that really matters now. Where does this road lead? From here, the future narrows into three possible paths. Not predictions, trajectories. The first is restraint through recalibration. Pressure works. Costs accumulate, and Moscow concludes that endurance no longer favors delay. Negotiations resume not out of goodwill, but necessity. This is the least dramatic outcome and the rarest. The second path is prolongation. No decisive breakthroughs, no real settlement. A managed stalemate where Ukraine survives, Russia obstructs, and the world adapts to instability as a permanent condition. Frozen conflict, warmed just enough to keep everyone uneasy. The third path is the most dangerous systemic fracture. Escalation widens. Miscalculations compound. And the war stops being about Ukraine altogether, becoming instead a proxy struggle over whose rules survive. Here's the hard truth. Systems don't choose the best outcome. They drift toward the one they are structured to produce. If credibility matters more than compromise, escalation wins. If agency is denied, resistance hardens. If endurance is mistaken for strategy, collapse comes quietly. The future will not be decided by statements. It will be decided by alignment between means, goals, and limits. And that brings us to the final insight. This moment will not be remembered for a rejected ceasefire. It will be remembered for what that rejection revealed. It revealed that power without flexibility becomes fragile. That diplomacy without respect becomes coercion. And that endurance, when chosen consciously, becomes a form of strength. Putin believed refusal would project dominance. Instead, it exposed rigidity. Trump believed adaptability would preserve leverage, and it did. And Ukraine proved something the system prefers to ignore. That agency cannot be delegated. Wars don't end when one side is exhausted. They end when systems can no longer sustain their contradictions. What happens next will test whether international order is still built on consent or merely enforced by force. And that question doesn't belong to Ukraine alone. It belongs to all of us. If you want to understand the world that's coming, not the one we hope for, keep following this analysis. Question simple narratives, reject passive consumption of history, because the most dangerous moments are not when wars begin, but when we convince ourselves we are no longer responsible for how they end. This story continues, and the choices made now will echo for decades. Stay engaged.